We're like halfway through the 9th generation of console games. Wowee, I guess.
It's being called the biggest waste of your hard-earned money to come along in years.
Because a lot of the modern stuff that's happening is kind of boring to a lot of people, and because a lot of the older stuff is at the very least very interesting, a lot of people have turned to retro games. And it just so happens that the 5th generation is one of the gens that is extremely influential, and I'd argue the most interesting, but it's also really overlooked. Granted, it's not the only one. The 7th generation is also often overlooked, but I've long wondered why people overlook the 5th gen specifically. I mean, looking at all the games that released during this time and how many of them influence the way we play stuff today, there's a lot to it. I get it with the 7th gen, it still feels too new for some people to go back to, but considering how many people love both the 6th and 4th gen, why single out the 5th? So to understand why it's so underappreciated, we need to go a few gens back to the beginning. The 1st generation was just Pong and Friends, so we can kinda skip it. The 2nd generation of gaming, the 2600 and co, well, let's be real here. The games that released during this generation were mostly shit. Yeah, there were some standouts like Solaris, but that came out during the time when the 3rd gen was already out anyways. As interesting as it was seeing developers make working games out of the equivalent of a plank and some string, actually playing them isn't really that interesting. I mean, some games provide whole minutes of content, or seconds in some cases, and I mean, the vast majority of them are just some looping high school romps. Some of them have really interesting ideas that would be cool to see expanded in later games like Solaris, but on their own, they're just very lackluster. The 3rd gen was quite interesting and misunderstood. You know, the NES and Master System. While it's often said these games have aged poorly, and in a lot of most, if not all cases, that is definitely true, I actually have a video on what aging poorly means, and I go more in depth about it there, but basically, it was a different time back then, and the standards were different. Back then, you would actually read the manual that came with the game because it actually had important information, maybe some story details, or a full-on map in the case of some games. You were also expected to, like, buy Nintendo Power magazines, strategy guides, talk with your friends about it and such. The times were different, and while some people did play the same game for 6 months straight on their own to figure it out, those were the exception, not the norm. During the 4th gen, we actually had some pretty big advancements in gaming. While the PC Engine and others existed, most of the discussion everywhere was centered around the Mega Drive and the Super Nintendo. And gaming started to morph a little. You see, as the developers now had a lot more processing power and storage to work with, they could make far larger, deeper games with more intricate stories. Larger teams gave us far more complex games, and those games could build off of solid mechanics already established in the previous generations. And while some games did try to jump the shark graphically, most of them stuck to now extremely pretty 2D graphics. So, in these 4 generations, we've seen an interesting progression. New technology allowed developers to make more complex and interesting games, however, it took a while for developers to make games that we'd actually enjoy playing today. Almost all 2nd gen games and a lot of 3rd gen games are just shit. Though even the shit 3rd gen games are often leagues above the okay 2nd gen games in terms of playability. Only during the 4th gen did we start to see games actually split from their arcade roots and spread their wings. Mario World, for instance, allowed you to actually save your progress, and you could chip away at the game's levels, secrets, or alternate paths at your own leisure, as opposed to the mostly linear path to victory present in earlier Mario games. The 5th generation of gaming was going to be an extension of this now mature game design. However, a large polygonal wrench was thrown into their plans. In 1992, we had some very interesting 3D titles, like Virtua Racing in arcades and Alone in the Dark on PC. 3D gaming existed before, though barely, but now it was becoming far less of a niche, year by year. While it was already taking off in the PC and arcade space, it took consoles until late 1994 to take the plunge. So here we are, the start of the 5th generation, the PlayStation and Saturn. They sort of cemented 3D as a standard. Of course, while it did exist beforehand on PCs and arcades and in very small quantities elsewhere, with mainstream consoles finally properly adopting it, the average person could now have the proper, uncompromised 3D graphics. As innovative as many of the early PC games were, it took PCs around the year 2000 to become cheap enough where most people had some sort of hardware 3D accelerator. So what did the consoles have? Well, they had some compromises, obviously, but also this new CD drive technology. The PS1 and Saturn used CDs, which had a few benefits and drawbacks. The drawbacks were a somewhat higher system price because the drive was a complex moving part, and you now needed to store the save data somewhere else because the disk was read-only. Also, the disk reading speed of 2.4 megabits per second was definitely workable, but not ideal. Yes, some games did manage to stream data from the disk without loading zones, but those games were the exception and not the norm. So what were the benefits? The largest SNES game was 6 megabytes in size. The smallest a PS1 or Saturn game could be was 650 megabytes, the size of a single CD. While there exist a few outliers, games would generally use up to 4 discs, or a total of 2.6 gigabytes of data. While there was some kind of extra complexity with how the game engine was designed because you had to swap discs and stuff, the increased storage space made the developers go wild. Some developers used the storage for CD quality music, some use it for super high quality animated backgrounds like in Resident Evil, while some games used it for FMVs and voice acting to tell a deeper story, and others just use it to store a lot more data for a lot larger games. This new 3D stuff itself, while it did take up more data, it also had a very interesting effect on games. You see, a lot of games try to adapt their existing formula into a polygonal 3D environment, while others focus on utilizing this tech for even better looking 2D graphics. To compare two very interesting games, Breath of Fire 3 and Final Fantasy VII were both JRPGs which used 3D graphics, but how they used them was vastly different. Breath of Fire took a very direct approach. They took the previously 2D tile-based world and basically just turned it into a properly 3D one, while Final Fantasy VII completely reworked the concept of a JRPG so it could work in a fully 3D environment, while also using the animated 2D backgrounds to create really stunning environments for 1997. New types of games that were not really properly seen before also came out. The first ever 3D platformer was Alpha Waves, and yeah, you can see that it's not that popular for a reason. The second one was Geograph Seal, and while solid, its effect was very limited. But the developers of Geograph Seal took what worked in that game and made Jumping Flash, the first console 3D platformer. At the time, though, the perspectives a lot of games use were, well, often fixed, either to your character or on a rail. This was because in order to make sure you could move precisely, you would often either have to use some form of tank controls, or you would need a fixed camera, and the level would need to be designed to work with specific angles. While not perfect, it worked really well with what they had. This way you could make sure that you were always aligned for jumps. Some games gave you a mech thing you would pilot from first person to contextualize your perspective, and also to avoid rendering your player character to save on some polygons. Games like Kingsfield were able to immerse the player in a dark and challenging 3D world far better than a previous 2D title were, and the first-person perspective really helped with that immersion, because instead of controlling a character, you were the character. Other games would use a fixed perspective behind the character to give you a different perspective on jumps, while others would just use a fixed following camera, and all of those were different, and all of those worked, even if some of them really weren't ideal. Either way, 3D gaming was flourishing, and then a year and a half late, the Nintendo 64 arrived. It brought us a controller with an analog stick as standard. While analog sticks existed previously, and the PS1 and Saturn already had flight sticks, and the Saturn's analog pad came out just 2 weeks after the N64 launched in Japan, the N64 stick had one big advantage. It may have been shit, it may have been designed for aliens, but it came as standard with the console, so games could be built around them completely. It took developers on the PlayStation and Saturn about a year to catch up, with games that properly took advantage of analog controls. The N64's analog stick may have been a really good standardization, but it had a significant flaw. That flaw being the cartridges. You see, the later Nintendo 64 games had a maximum cartridge size of 64 megabytes, while the earlier ones had a 16 or 32 megabyte limit. If you add it all up, the average N64 game used a 24 megabyte cartridge, and that's counting the later 64 megabyte games. Mario 64 came out on an 8 megabyte cartridge, Ocarina of Time on a 32 megabyte one, and Paper Mario on a 64 megabyte one. The largest N64 game had a tenth of the storage space of the smallest PlayStation 1 or Saturn game. While the cartridges did have a faster read speed, it is clear that they were a step in the wrong direction. While that wasn't the only issue on the system, it was the most apparent and significant. Square left Nintendo for Sony after they realized Final Fantasy VII and their many other games just weren't possible on the Nintendo 64. This was the age of grand JRPGs and large games that used the CD to store a lot of data, and in this time period, Nintendo released a system which lacked a CD drive. What were they thinking? Later on in the generation, we'd see a ton of very interesting and unique games come out from basically every publisher for basically every system. Sega would launch a second 5th gen console, the Dreamcast. Just remember, console generations are made-up terms, they're not really set in stone, and with the way I see it, the Dreamcast is more 5th than 6th gen. Not in terms of hardware per se, even if it was underpowered compared to the other 6th gen systems, but in terms of game output and lifespan, the Dreamcast was, during its short time on the market, competing against the Nintendo 64 and PS1. And for a very short time, the PS2. It was dead before the 5th gen ended, and before most 6th gen consoles even released, excluding the PS2. And the games on it really shared a lot more with 5th gen gaming than 6th gen gaming, so that's why I believe it is a 5th gen console. But yeah, later on, tons of unique games came out on basically all 5th gen systems. While yes, the Nintendo 64 had a bit of a problem with game variety, it still had some very interesting releases. But just looking at all of the games that released in these systems, it might seem weird that this generation is the one that people overlook. And I'd like to blame Nintendo. Indirectly, of course. It's not really their fault, but hear me out. Going back to Nintendo 64, their storage space wasn't the only flaw the cartridges had. They were far more expensive to make, for several reasons, so developing the Nintendo 64 was far more expensive. Because of that, weirdly enough, The Saturn, even though it sold under a third as much as the Nintendo 64, had far more games and a far more diverse library. Developers on the Nintendo 64 had to spend more money, so they couldn't be as experimental. They had to be confident their game would sell more copies to break even, so a lot of games looked far more alike, and the ones that really stood out were either ports or first-party games because they had a larger budget and could experiment more. And that's a part of the problem. People often think about the Nintendo 64 when they look back at the 5th generation of gaming, and there's a simple reason why. Sony and Sega don't really talk about their 5th gen libraries that much. While the Saturn had a very cool library, Sega doesn't really mention any of the incredible games they had. And while Sony sometimes does brush over a few of their key titles from back in the day, their efforts are far smaller in comparison to Nintendo. Yeah, Nintendo lets you play a few select games from the Nintendo 64 on the new systems, and while Sony does that as well, and there's quite a few PlayStation 1 titles, most of them aren't really anything to write home about. Yeah, look, we have Toy Story 2, 4 Worms games, but no Resident Evil 2 or 3, no Crash or Spyro. This is partially because I know how much larger the PS1 library is, but also because most big Sony games with third-party titles they can't re-release on their system without the consent of the publisher. And often, the publishers can be really uncooperative. Having a gigantic library, in which I counted over 400 games worth playing, which is more than the Nintendo 64's entire library, by the way, does have a downside. Because there was so much to play, the nostalgia around the PlayStation 1 is sort of fractured between all of the great games. While yeah, tons of people played Metal Gear Solid, Final Fantasy, Gran Turismo, Crash, Spyro, etc., those were only some of the many games that people played. The Nintendo 64's higher cost per game made it so Nintendo 64 owners often owned less games than PlayStation 1 owners. And also, the Nintendo 64 had pack-in titles. That way, Nintendo could make sure you owned at least one big, quality game, like Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time, while on the PlayStation 1, you were basically on your own. Though I'm pretty sure there were some pack-ins in Europe, but overall, no global pack-ins existed. Also, Nintendo YouTubers love to talk about retro Nintendo games, and during the last decade, they've drilled the Nintendo 64 into the heads of people by talking about the same small library of games. And those games are good, no shit, but it paints a very skewed picture of the 5th generation of gaming. The reason why the 5th generation of gaming is so underappreciated is because people think of the Nintendo 64 first. If you've watched a lot of retro gaming YouTube, especially back in the day like I did, this is probably what you would think of the 5th generation. Oh yeah, so it was like Mario, 64, Zelda, Banjo. There was also like Crash and Spyro and Final Fantasy and Metal Gear on the PlayStation. The Saturn was there too with the arcade games. But honestly, this generation was kinda janky, and while it was an important step, there wasn't really that much in there worth coming back to. And plus, I mean, Zelda's being remade on the 3DS. It's kind of irrelevant. And that's kind of the issue. Because the Nintendo 64 had such a gimped storage medium, the games that came out on it kinda looked the same, at a glance at least. Blurry textures, janky low-poly models, despicable controls, at least sometimes, though the first-party Nintendo games were kind of the outliers here, and the funny glitches that all the speedrunners use. But most games people talked about in the system were spiritually either Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time, Banjo, Mario 64, Castlevania, Ocarina of Time, Gex 2, Mario 64, Body Harvest, Ocarina of Time. And while there were outliers, most games people would often talk about would fit into one of those two specific molds. So, looking at the PlayStation 1, people would often just look for the same sort of surface-level games, and they would come up across Spyro or Crash of Metal Gear Solid. Final Fantasy was often too big to ignore, so it was also always mentioned, but the vast library of the PlayStation 1 was often just not really explored in such a great depth because, at a glance, you really didn't know where to start. So, if you want to know the real reason why it was so underappreciated, it's because it's just so vast and wide in terms of game variety and game quality that it was kind of rare for specific games to have a ton of nostalgia formed specifically around them on the Sony and Sega front. While the Nintendo 64's small game library, cartridges, and pack-ins essentially forced developers to make games that were, on a surface level, kinda similar to Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time. And because of that, this sort of general idea of the Nintendo 64 and the 5th generation formed. And because the visuals of the Nintendo 64 aged worse because blur ages worse than Jaggies, people would often assume most 5th gen games looked like something on the level of Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time. And part of the reason why Nintendo games are talked about so much is because Nintendo just puts in far more effort than Sony or Sega to beat the drums of the 5th generation, even though Sony, and especially Sega, had a far larger amount of cool things to show for it. Then because of that, while YouTube has covered both Sony and Nintendo games and Sega games, because there were far fewer Nintendo games, far more videos came out on the same game, creating a general perception that the Nintendo 64 was far more popular than it actually was, and it also caused people to think of Mario 64 as the first 5th gen game you really kind of think of. Another big issue, which I talked in another video about, was because the Nintendo 64 had a mostly child audience. A lot of the people who played the PlayStation 1 would be far more nostalgic about the NES or the SNES or the Mega Drive or something, while a lot of the time the Nintendo 64 was a lot of kids' first real system. So, to them, they would be far more nostalgic about Mario 64 as they grew up than somebody who played Final Fantasy VII in their 20s, because if they were nostalgic about something, it would probably be the game they played as a kid. I mean, hell, I'm in my 20s now. If I were to play Final Fantasy XVI now, I would probably be far less nostalgic about it than I would be if I played Final Fantasy X or 12 as a kid. And the thing is that this sort of consolidation of what people think the 5th gen is sucks. And it's not just the fact, oh, they think of Mario 64 first, because yeah, that's a game I am not particularly in love with. Imagine if they thought of Floating Runner first instead. No, it's the fact that people assume that all there really is to the 5th gen is Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time or similar, even though so many great, fun, and interesting games came out on all platforms, even on the Nintendo 64. That's the part that sucks. The part where people will just shrug their shoulders and assume that it's all there is, it's either Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time, instead of just looking through the library and finding something they may enjoy. To them, it's either Mario 64 or Ocarina of Time. I wonder which one of those A-Train fits into.